Hey everybody, welcome back to the Generative Edge. My name is Brandon Eychaner and I'm the Natural Language Processing and Generative AI Practice Lead for Deloitte Central Europe. I'm joined today by two special guests. First of all, we have Dagmar.
Hi, I'm Dagmar Bendova. I work in Deloitte CE, AI and Data Group, and I'm part of Brandon's team focusing on natural language processing and generative AI use cases.
Fantastic. And we've also got a special guest, Shannon Pym with us.
Yeah, hi everyone. So Shannon Pym, in terms of a bit of background, so I've been with the firm for 7 years now. I actually sit within a department called Deloitte Managed Solutions in the UK. And then within DMS, I actually lead a team called the Intelligence Services Centre. So in this role, I've kind of got a particular focus on tech and innovation. But in terms of my technical background, I guess you could say I tend to bridge the gap between kind of the technical and business worlds. So having had experience in both, however, you definitely won't find me personally engineering the models, but great to be on and talk about such a hot topic.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. And I guess our work kind of goes back several years, right? So what was the first use case that we did together? It was AOSINT, I guess, automated open source intelligence, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And maybe just to kind of expand on that a bit more. So in terms of the Intelligence Services Centre, we essentially kind of focus on a bunch of different use cases off the back of using kind of AOSINT or kind of open source data. So this could be like anything from supply chain due diligence, it could be regulatory sensing, all the way through to kind of ESG reporting and country level resilience.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess in terms of what that actually means, and Brandon, you're exactly right in terms of kind of the AOSINT data that we consumed, but more broader than that, we were kind of leveraging technology around kind of machine learning, NLP, named entity recognition, to basically be able to make sense of the data before we then applied kind of a layer of human intelligence analysts.
Gotcha.
Who would then kind of conduct a review of those raw data signals. And the kind of analyst's role was basically to identify the relevancy of a signal.
Gotcha. And when you say data, it's news text, right? So it's primarily news information or online text data that was coming in on a daily basis?
Exactly. Yeah. So kind of millions of data points coming in daily, and then across kind of maybe 600 of different domain event type areas.
So working with text data is obviously like really, really labor intensive, I would say. Do you have like a large team that works on this, or is it like a very small team that's been enabled by tools?
Yeah, it's definitely the latter. So what we tend to say is about 90% of the end-to-end kind of managed service operating model is tech driven, and then kind of 10% is around the human intervention. So kind of verifying insights, generating outputs. Having talked through that at a really high level, you can probably hear some opportunities for the GenAI efficiencies in terms of the human intervention and kind of generating summaries. So maybe, Brandon, we could talk through kind of the first GenAI use case we designed and developed.
Oh, for sure. So we've actually mentioned it on the podcast before, but this is a summarization tool. So essentially, a lot of that manual work that was being done was to write summaries on top of news articles, and not just any summaries, but it was like a very specific format. And we automated that process using generative AI. Deployed the software into some cloud provider, and then allowed practitioners to access that tool through like just a web app. So they would log in and generate summaries based on top of text data, and get the output. So instead of taking like 20 minutes or something for writing an average summary, we now generate them in like 3 to 5 seconds. So that's, a 99% reduction in overall time spent reading and writing stuff. Has that been helpful? Maybe that's a dumb question, but like...
No, and I think it's not only enabled us to kind of be more cost competitive for our clients, but we've not had to kind of have to worry about kind of the risk around that, because we have kind of the quality measures either side. So it's been the perfect use case for GenAI. And Brandon obviously can't not mention that this was kind of our claim to fame in the UK, because it was the first UK kind of use case to be approved for production use.
Ooh,
and I'm sure
fancy.
that will never lose as well. But yeah, it's been massive, and I think it's definitely enabled us to go that step further in terms of scalability without losing, like I said, kind of that kind of quality risk.
So Dasha, you've worked on a couple of different projects, partially on the summarization tool, partially on other, like working with lots of text documents and trying to get structured data out of them. Can you talk about maybe just the validation process? How do you make sure that a generative model is creating outputs that look the same that we would expect, since people were doing it and now we're automating it with some model? How do you actually validate that you're getting it correctly?
Yeah, so for that, obviously, you need to keep people in the loop of the validation, because that's like your like starting point from where you want to start to provide the same quality as before. It's like your threshold.
Yeah.
Well, if you provide better quality, then it's even better. So yeah, basically you need to recruit your evaluators, and what is like the most simple thing to do is to present them with ask them to make summaries for a certain amount of articles, and then provide summaries from GenAI for these articles, and then ask your evaluators to evaluate whether the summary from GenAI is like matching the human summary in terms of like what information is provided. Is it in the correct format? Is it in like a correct like tone,
Right,
or
exactly.
in fulfilling all your requirements on the like summary format and summary information and so on. And then you just are able to measure like, okay, what was the acceptance by the users? You can look at the edge cases where there was not acceptance, and inspect why. Then you can go and fine tune your model actually, or your prompt to better correspond to the user expected format.
Excellent.
So yeah, that's like the most simple thing you can do, and actually I think that's like the best one you can do to gain human trust.
Right, for sure. Actually, one of the questions we get all the time is like how, people who are not familiar with generative AI, they generally think, oh my gosh, how are we going to put this at a model instead of having a person do it? And then how am I supposed to trust the outputs? Well, the answer is usually the validation step. You have to like test it enough times to make sure that, okay, 99% of the time it's of acceptable quality. If it reaches that threshold, then it goes to production. Are there any use cases that you've worked on? Because I know you're also working on similar like summarization and data filtering kind of work with a, let's say, non-governmental organization. Are there any use cases that are not as easy to validate?
I would say these are use cases where the summarization was not done before, which is actually the project you mentioned, because that's like something new they want to introduce for the users in the system, and they have not done it before, like by humans. So that is hard to validate, because you can ask humans to read the summaries and compare with text and compare with like their knowledge and expertise, but still it will be a lot subjective matter whether users like it or not. So that is hard to validate. Yeah.
Gotcha. And to go back to Shannon, actually, do you have any other use cases that you're like interested in building out, or things where you see like there's still that huge manual effort on something that could be automated? And what would you recommend our listeners look into in terms of like use cases that are feasibly that would feasibly fit into the bucket of like generative AI or AI in general when working with like text data?
Yeah, I mean, I guess definitely in terms of the next use case, and I guess it would be amazing to work towards kind of further automation of the triaging of data. So obviously we've kind of developed something fantastic that speeds up the summarization of things that we've already deemed relevant. But actually kind of the main chunk of effort, especially when you kind of handle big data, is around kind of then identifying whether something's even relevant before it gets to the humans. And obviously there is kind of AI methods being used to kind of support that at the moment, but I think further acceleration through GenAI to kind of almost like a second go at kind of capturing and kind of identifying relevance would be amazing. obviously we've just touched on as well some of the challenges around that through if you almost kind of put rubbish data in and you get kind of rubbish data out because you're skewing the model's performance with the irrelevant stuff. And I think that also is something that could then cause one of the kind of buzzwords around all of this which is the hallucinations.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess the other kind of challenge to think about for kind of triaging such big amounts of data is obviously on the kind of storage component of that. But Brandon, I don't know if you've got any kind of thoughts on mitigations. I know we've been kind of talking through it as a use case, haven't we?
Yeah, I don't want to get too technical, but
Please do.
yeah. So I guess when we say triage, we also mean something. I mean, data scientists would probably refer to it as classification, document classification. And I think in this case, like the Intelligence Services Center, they do like risk mitigation and risk identification in news, and they use those as signals. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
So, for people, this is also a really difficult task because whenever you say risk, it could actually mean anything. And I'm assuming that you guys have like a finite list of things that you would consider risks, like bankruptcy, earthquakes that hit, viruses, something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and if there's a finite list, great. That's super useful. You can use labeled data that like people have been making when delivering those services, and then you use that as training data, right? But if they're already doing that labeling process and there's 300 different labels, it's actually really difficult for a person to intimately know, the threshold to classify something into one of those 300 categories. Do you have multiple people working on like the same data to make sure that they come to the same conclusion, or how does that actually go?
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of steps to the process currently. So there's the first stage, which is kind of ML, NLP, named entity recognition,
Mm-hmm.
which is part of the AI already, but obviously not including any Gen AI,
Mm-hmm.
which is essentially trying to understand the context, right? So it
Yeah.
would be able to identify, is it kind of Apple down the fruit and veg aisle, or is it Apple the company?
Mm-hmm.
Also, is it the right kind of jurisdiction of Apple, as an example, because you may kind of want to kind of do reporting on legal entity
Mm-hmm.
basis. So I guess it's kind of mostly around that.
Perfect. Actually, there's a really good tie-in then, Dasha, because you're working with named entity recognition, right?
Yeah, to some extent.
To some extent.
Yeah.
What are the issues with bad named entity recognition? For our listeners, if you don't know what named entity recognition is, we call it NER. It's just extracting people, places,
locations, companies.
Exactly.
Yeah, basically what you call it, like entity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you give it a name, and then you want to extract this information. Yeah, the issue is if you want to use this information for further processing, then if your named entity recognition engine is not efficient and not delivering super perfect results, then you are losing information for the further processing. So, for example, if you want to introduce some filtering on your data, I want to see only, I don't know, Apple organization, as Shannon mentioned, then if Apple is not recognized correctly in certain context, then you are losing this information from your filter, and
right,
it can be problematic for you,
to say the least.
Yeah.
And so now to tie it back into generative AI, you doing that with like traditional language models like BERT or things that were around before GPT. They required a lot of training data so that you could like train a model to understand what an organization is or a person or a geopolitical entity. Have you used generative models for named entity recognition, or do you see any potential there, or pitfalls, that kind of thing?
I have seen the usage of GenAI model for this. I haven't done it exactly like this myself. But yeah, the results, they looked great because, as an example, GenAI was able to guess a country based on some event happening in that country, while the named entity recognition engine wasn't able to recognize it. The country name was not mentioned in the data, but there was event which is specific for that country, and GenAI was able to say, okay, this is this location.
Interesting.
Based on the event. So yeah, that's amazing thing that you can get this extra information from it. On the other hand, you kinda are losing control with GenAI because you just like throw your data onto it with some instructions,
right?
But you don't have means to really hard code the instructions. So that's a thing where it becomes a little bit complicated, and also for further processing, it's hard to ensure the data quality and the quality of the result. How like with the name entity recognition, you get some scores, and you can say, okay, above this score, I will take this as my threshold. Above this score, take it as successful result. Below the threshold, do not take it. With GenAI, if it just spits on you the answer,
that's what you get.
Yeah, that's what you get. So like you don't have this like score of precision of recognizing the country based on this. And so I guess that's like more prone to errors or to hallucinations.
Yeah.
Because the GenAI will try to give you the answer you want to get from it.
Right.
But sometimes it may not be possible, and you may get to hallucinations.
Gotcha.
I think there's a fine balance there, isn't there? Because if you're thinking around the big data kind of use case and kind of triaging large amounts of signals or classification of them, it's kind of where do you set the kind of the parameters between kind of what comes through and what doesn't, and then the risk by default of missing things. But I think it's even a really important point around having kind of explainable but also trustworthy kind of AI or kind of Gen AI that then means you can backtrack and kind of identify kind of the auditable kind of what's behind the scenes around the decisions. I think that's one of the main things that comes up when speaking to clients is what kind of mitigations and governance is kind of implemented in the background to kind of manage that, not just when you kind of go live with something, but on a continuous basis as well.
I have understood and seen as a challenge is to get structured output from GenAI and get it in consistent ways so that, your further data processing is relying on some specific structure, but then the response from GenAI would be in little bit different structure, and then it would cause you problems. So obviously you need to, code some guardrails and so on. But yeah, that from my perspective would be a challenge if using GenAI for something like name entity recognition.
Not just the output data, but also the format of that data.
Yeah. On the note of using GenAI for like name entity recognition, from developer perspective, from what I have seen, it's not very easy to get like structured output from GenAI. And when you want to use this structured output for further data processing, it may cause you problem if there is, some different output in one of the cases. So you need some guardrails around it and so on. What are your thoughts on this?
This is a problem that we literally have struggled with for the entire past 2 years. So implementing generative AI work, like you expect the data to be of a certain quality, but you also expect it to be in a certain format if you're going to then put it into some kind of like structured database or to get insights from it. And part of the problem, for those of you who don't develop with generative AI like APIs, sometimes it'll give you back an object that we call JSON. It's like a structured object basically that looks like a dictionary. And sometimes it'll give you back something that is a improperly formatted JSON, and then it becomes completely unusable in all downstream applications and all of your software. So a lot of the work that we did in development was to like figure out, okay, if it gives us back like mostly correct JSON, how can we process that and still get some of the data without throwing it all away, which literally took months. And I really see the shift recently, just in the last 2 or 3 months, where commercially available APIs, OpenAI, the AWS, they're making available these models that actually force structured JSON output, which is really, really nice. So finally, after like more than a year of asking for this feature, you can actually turn it on inside of the model when you work with the APIs. If the model came out after like maybe September, so it's really, really recent, but you can force structured output and it will follow the format that you actually give it. Hopefully that wasn't too technical, but yeah, it's super
sounds
helpful.
Really useful to have this knowledge.
Yeah. And lastly, I want to turn to Shannon. So Shannon, what kind of use cases would you expect, or what kind of things do you expect out of generative AI going forward? And how do you think it will make a difference in what your team does?
So yeah, I think maybe just generally kind of Gen AI moving forward across kind of businesses and kind of usage more broadly is kind of twofold. I would really love to see even more of a focus from kind of businesses globally on continuing to actually bridge the skills gap.
Mm-hmm.
So really prioritizing kind of investment in training programs on AI technology specifically to basically encourage like a culture of learning, but not just learning, it's innovation and then the adoption of it.
For sure,
I
yeah.
think that would be amazing. And then probably the last one is just recognition that these developments are here to help us spend less time doing the day-to-day kind of repetitive tasks that make and that this would make us more efficient rather than posing kind of risks to jobs in their entirety. So just kind of further embracing it from that perspective as well.
That's a fantastic and optimistic note to end on. Dasha, I want to thank you so much for coming in and co-hosting.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and Shannon, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much. I've loved it.
Fantastic. So that is a wrap up for our 2024 season. We will be back after the holidays. So happy holidays, everybody, and generate responsibly.
Thank you for listening to The Generative Edge, a Deloitte Central Europe and AWS production. Your hosts are Brandon Eychaner, Vyasaraj Kulkarni, and Donovan Spronk. Our show is executive produced by Stephanie Cohen, Vansh Luthra, Ian Masters, and the Deloitte studio in Prague. Head writers are Stephanie Cohen and Brandon Eychaner. Our sound and audio engineer is Wojtek Krasa, who also serves as our editor and videographer. Michal Trusina is our graphic designer. Our marketing and social media managed by Stephanie Cohen and the Deloitte studio in Prague. And our theme song was written and produced by Jakub Flaszek. Don't forget to rate and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.